Welcome everyone to this video of mine. This video will talk about a verse called Chronicle of Suffering, which is the story of a wiki user called Author the False One. Now in a nutshell, the verse itself is showing, as the name suggests, the suffering of many entities that happen across the years, worlds and universes. It isn't only about suffering, there is an ongoing villain, a hero, and entities that are called creators, who are the closest of what you can call a god. Now, before I can speak of the scale of Chronicle of Suffering, we need to talk about the verses it stands above, as the Chronicle of Suffering is the Author the False One's strongest verse, with it creating the author's other verses in canon. Now if you have seen the video about the scale of MILF 404 in the end part, then that is great, but if you didn't, then let me recap. Now in GAM, or called Gods and Mortals, a universe is the first structure, but also the one giving the most context for things, and also making everything above the universe scale extremely high.
There is an absolute infinite number of universes stacked on top one another, with each universe conceptually transcending the one below and holding absolute power over the ones below. There it is shown that the absolute infinity is used across all the structures and barriers, with there being 3 barriers. The first layer, the dimensional layer, contains all the universes, with it then having universes above it contained by the second dimensional layer repeating itself. The second and third barrier do the same thing, all an absolute infinite amount of times. The dimensions, which are realms, contain many universes, all unique in their own right. From the number of dimensions to how they behave, like how one universe had things move in negative speed. With the dimensional layer transcending the concept of dimensions, and the context of transcendence previously mentioned counts for everything except if stated otherwise in the story. With the universes containing the cosmology itself continuously in its stacks and possible and impossible possibilities, and the second structure of the great machines transcends math itself. The cosmology page states how the beings in the great machine, which would also count for higher structures, use the word absolute infinity at that point only because it is easier to describe for the readers. Now you may wonder, why did I talk about GIM when it is a video about Chronicle of Suffering? Well, that's because of this. Now this is a piece of art that the author of the Chronicle of Suffering did to depict it the way his verse is built. As you can see, GIM is in a place called the Dream Realm, which the name suggests is where dreams are located. To be clear, the Dream Realm is still being written how it shall behave, but the author has in mind that the Dream Realm isn't the sole place where every single dream is located, more like most dreams of the verses where there is no sort of dream realm in them. Now as it shows, GIM and the Chronicle of Suffering have a gap that is called the Dream Gap. Now it states how the gap between a dream and reality cannot be quantified, with one dream of a being called the peace of God having tried to quantify the gap of each dream inside a larger dream with math, but with the beings inside the dream knowing it is wrong. Not only that, it compares it to the lower void with the upper void, saying how if every universe concepts and realities were put together, it wouldn't be able to quantify the gap that these two voids in the Chronicle of Suffering have. This means that not only mathematically there is no way to describe the gap, but also conceptually, as it then states how no foundation, description, or truth can even describe the gap, as they are more real than the dreams, and that being why dreamers, so lucid dreamers, are then all powerful in their dreams. This shows that there is R greater than F4 called reality fiction transcendence, with the Chronicle of Suffering viewing the entire GIM and rest in the dream worlds just as dreams. Now this entire dream gap scan doesn't count for the entire Chronicle of Suffering, so it isn't a verse where Adam solos a verse. Instead it counts for the creators, Jack Reaper and his archenemy called Aiden Fate, with some other characters. But in a nutshell, every being in the Chronicle of Suffering that are capable of injuring a creator, Aiden or Jack, would scale higher than the peace of God who created the entire GIM, and this isn't counting the Tree of Knowledge and the Everything Tree, 2 other projects of the author who also scale above GIM because of the dream gap, as they are more real than it. For context, the Tree of Knowledge is the author-owned version of the SCP verse, with the Everything Tree being the author version of Alpha Tale and the True God verse wiki. I didn't use them as they are still being written like the GIM True Jack verse, based on, well, the name says already, the name of the wiki that the author makes his own version of. In conclusion, using the dream scan and all the verses that the author is writing or making own version of, the Chronicle of Suffering maincast can be scaled and spattled to boundless and to beyond any numeric layers into it, with that also in character stats and profiles extraversal. That is, however, when using the dream scan of the verse and so-called extended canon, meaning using all the other works too. I will make a second video talking about the inverse scale of the Chronicle of Suffering of the characters' abilities, their feats and where they scale when not using the dream scans, and only the cosmology of the Chronicle of Suffering itself and not all the other cosmology that they either created or surpass because it is part of theirs. As without these scans the cast becomes extremely weak when compared to the other verses, where one could easily think that they would beat the Chronicle of Suffering if one never read Chronicle of Suffering or had seen the dream scans of how they are the strongest from the author all works. That is however for a future video where I show the scale of the verse. Many will most likely be surprised by just how different it becomes. The next video will be a True God verse 1 where I will scale the character called Zenith the Beyonder. Like and leave a sub, and if you have suggestions leave them in the comment, as they may become future videos on this channel.